Hey everyone, thanks for joining us for this video today. In this video, we're going to be talking about how to build a computer from scratch. I have my friend Brandon here today. And Brandon, how long have you been building computers for?
I've been building computers for about 15 years.
Awesome. That's super awesome, Brandon. I've also been building computers for about the same time, around 15 years. And we're making this video series today because we've seen a lot of videos online that use really technical language or maybe skip a step here and there on how to build a computer. I've also had a lot of friends tell me that they're just scared, they're just overwhelmed when they look at all the parts or like get inside the machine. And so today, Brandon and I are going to be walking you through step by step, component to component on how to build a computer. All right, that said, let's go ahead and get started with the build.
All right, so first we're gonna start with the solid state drive. Then we're gonna move to our CPU. We're gonna toss in the CPU cooler, and then we're gonna add our RAM. So first, there are actually covers on this motherboard for our solid state drives. It's kind of hard to see, but right here it says M.2. That's the type of drive we're installing. So it'll be nice and perfect. I'll move this over so you guys can see. It's right there. But what we're gonna do is, I have my Phillips head screwdriver. I'm literally just gonna unscrew this bracket here. And there's two sides to it. And you literally just take it off. This is what the underside looks like. This is actually thermal tape. Helps keep your drive nice and cool. And this right here is where the slot is. This is an M.2 slot. So we'll take this, take our drive, and you'll notice this drive doesn't necessarily sit nice and flush with this board here. So we're gonna actually need a kind of mounting point for us to add. So I'm gonna go grab that. All right, so I grabbed my mounting screws and it was inside of my motherboard box here. Looks kind of like that. Nice little mounting screw. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna make sure that this is lined up to the exact slot that I need. And I'm literally just gonna actually hand tighten this guy in. Nice and easy. Doesn't need to be super tight. You actually don't want it to be super tight because you don't want to flex this motherboard, because inside of here are these little metal pieces called traces. And if you bend them too much, it can cause some troubles. So I'm gonna take my solid state drive, go ahead and install that. The pins line up. You'll kind of see there's this little small section in the corner here and this larger section here. They line up to what this port allows for, this slot. I'm just gonna kind of slightly push it in until you hear it almost click. And then I'm gonna take the screw, again, came in the same bag with my motherboard. And these are luckily magnetic, so it makes it a lot easier. And all I'm gonna do here, I'm just gonna screw it in. Again, I don't want to be too tight, but I want it to be kind of firm, a little snug there, just so it doesn't flop around. I don't want this to move around too much because this is where all my data is gonna be stored. Cool, so now that we have that, we're gonna reinstall our cover back on top of it. And before I do that, this is actually usually some kind of cover on there, so we need to remove that before we reinstall. There we go, look at that. Nice. Okay, so then I'll take my cover, slide that back on, line it up with the slot. Cool. And just screw it in. Pretty easy. Great. Hard drive installed. Pretty quick and easy. All right, next is gonna be our CPU, our central processing unit. This is gonna be installed right here. Notice when you get a little bit closer on this, in the very corner of one of these sides here is a little, it looks kind of like an arrow. It's in this corner right here. And it actually corresponds with an arrow on your CPU. And if I look It's actually, you see that little gold contact right down there? That's the arrow I'm talking about. I'll take it out of the case so you can see. There we go. So again, the arrow is on this side now. That arrow corresponds with the arrow on this motherboard. And it's important you have these lined up because these are actually pins. And if you bend these pins, it's really bad for the CPU. And a lot of times if you bend them enough, it makes it so you can't even use it anymore. So what we're gonna do is there's this little latch right here. I'm gonna take the latch up so it allows me to seat my CPU. And when you close the latch, it kind of moves this top piece so it seats it in place. And again, I'm gonna make sure that this lines up with that. So I'm gonna flip this over, meeting my corners right there. I'm gonna slightly sit it on top, and it should feel like it kind of sits in those little grooves really nicely. It's gonna feel a little loose, that's okay. And then we're just gonna take this and seat it. And there we go. Our CPU is in the motherboard. Okay, next is my CPU cooler. CPU cooler is gonna sit right on top of our processor here. One big difference that I'm gonna do, other than what the instructions say to do, is I'm actually gonna apply my own thermal compound, this thermal paste that we saw before. This thermal paste is a little bit higher quality than what comes with my CPU cooler. So I'm gonna install my own. So first things first, I'm actually using the instructions to make sure that I'm installing it properly. And first, I'm gonna remove the original plastic clamps for my AMD motherboard. That's what this guy is here. Okay. And again, I'm actually just gonna set these screws aside. I have a nice little magnetic mat that I can set my screws in so I don't lose them. Great, that comes out pretty easy. A little bit more. Okay, last one. Awesome. Okay, last bracket. So now, once I have that out of the way, I need to install some screws onto the motherboard to replace the brackets. And this is gonna be the basis for my new CPU cooler. So what I'll do is I'm gonna take this smaller side, and they're thumb screws, meaning you use your thumb to tighten them. I'm just gonna take this, and I'm gonna hold it down. Nice and easy. Just screwing this in, and again, it's gonna be thumb tightened. We don't wanna use a screwdriver. Don't wanna flex that too much. Okay, very nice. Okay, let's be a little wobbly at first. Okay. Cool. And then the last one. All right. So those should be nice and tight. So I have actually an extra screw that they provided me as well. I'm gonna set that aside. We won't actually be needing it, but I'll keep it for later in case I need to make any changes. So next, the instructions say we need to install the fans onto the radiator. The radiator is this top piece right here. It's actually where the liquid sits inside of my CPU cooler. And yes, this is a water cooler, so water does flow through it. So I'm gonna take my fan and I'm gonna install them. And I'm gonna install them in a way that works best for my case. These CPU coolers, especially on this block here gets really warm. It flows water through this block over to the radiator, and what it's trying to do is it's taking heat away from the processor, and that heat needs to go somewhere, so you need these fans to blow it outside of your case. You don't want it blowing inside into your computer because that can heat up your whole system, and we definitely don't want a lot of heat. Cool. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take this and I'm gonna install my fan. So I'm gonna set aside my motherboard really quick. Nice. And then we'll take our cooler here and then we're gonna install our fans. So it's the same sort of concept, pretty straightforward, luckily. We'll take our fans and get that installed. And if we look at my motherboard, we can kind of see there are headers. Headers are what we're going to end up plugging all of these cables into. We'll kind of see them down here. They're on the right side of the motherboard. And the way that I'm going to plug this in, this is going to be where the right is. So I want to make sure that my cables are routing to the right side. So we'll install one, and this spins like this, meaning the air is gonna flow down and through this radiator, which is exactly what we want. Because the radiator is gonna be mounted, this is the top portion of my case, so the fan's gonna take all of the air and blow it out, which is exactly what I want. So, take that, we'll grab a couple of screws, and these are gonna be mounting screws for my fan. They should all be the same, but let me make sure. Yep, cool. So I'm gonna take some screws, and I'm literally just gonna screw them in to my location. Now I don't wanna tighten these completely all the way yet, because I wanna make sure that all of the holes line up. So I'm just gonna tighten them enough to where I get some resistance. Okay. Cool. Last one for this first fan. And we are gonna be installing two fans, because this is a 240 millimeter radiator, which means this 120 millimeter, that's the size. This is 120 millimeter fan, and this will be another one. So we'll have two. So I'm gonna route the cables in here again. I want them to go near the right side so they reach. Perfect. And then I'm gonna do the exact same thing. Take this, make sure it lines up perfectly. Nice. Long screw. You guys a better view here. Great. And this should be my last fan screw. Perfect. Okay. Pretty easy. So my fans are installed. I want to go ahead and tighten them. I want to make sure I got it all nice and tight. These you can probably do a little bit tighter than you would do on your motherboard, because this is just a piece of metal that's holding the water in it. Nice and tight. You don't want it to vibrate because it's going to make your case noisy. So nice and tight. Okay. So now that we have that, next is there is a cold plate, which is just this piece of plastic that sits on the bottom of this mount that goes on top of your CPU cooler. It's the CPU block. We're gonna take it off. It's just protecting the bottom of this. Now you don't wanna touch this plate here if you can help it, because any sort of smudges or fingerprints or things like that can put oil on there, and that really affects performance pretty drastically. And this is the part where I said we're gonna make some adjustments. So you'll see this gray stuff here This is called thermal compound or thermal paste, and it's what we're gonna have directly on top of our processor, our CPU. But I'm gonna replace this with my own thermal compound because my thermal compound's a little better, we'll call it. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take Noctua, my thermal paste, came with these little, they're just cleaning wipes. And they're used to clean off your either block or your processor. But I've never installed this processor before, so there's no thermal paste yet. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna open up this packet and I'm gonna wipe off the thermal paste that's already there. Take this back off. This stuff can get all over the place, so be careful. You literally just kind of wipe it off. You'll see it starts to come off pretty easy. This is just thermal paste. Now, you be careful with this. You do not want this stuff getting in your eyes. You don't want this stuff getting in your mouth, any of that sort of thing. So you do need to be very careful. You can definitely wear gloves. That's a good idea. Or just be super careful not to touch this. And if you do, make sure you wash your hands very good afterwards, just to make sure you're not touching your face, your mouth, or anything. Okay, pretty clean. This is just an alcohol wipe, so that'll dry off in just a second. Set this to the side. I'm gonna put that back on, and I'm gonna throw away my extra packaging here. And then I'm gonna grab my thermal paste, have it ready to go, because we're not actually gonna put that back onto the CPU cooler directly. We're gonna actually take this thermal paste and we're gonna put it onto our CPU, onto our processor. So that's all wiped off, ready to go. We're gonna get ready to install this block here onto my processor, onto my motherboard and the CPU. So we'll take our motherboard like so, and we're gonna take our CPU block, which is this guy here. I'm actually gonna turn this around a little bit so I can get to it a little bit better. Nice. This is gonna look something like this near the end of this. It's gonna sit right on top of it. My radiator is going to be near the top here, and that's going to be mounted inside of my case. So next, what I'm going to do is I'm going to install or apply my thermal compound onto the processor. Again, thermal compound, this guy here, onto my processor. And you normally need to get something like a card to kind of spread out the thermal paste, or you can also not even use that. If you apply the correct amount, which I'll show you, of thermal paste, when you place your CPU block on top of it, it'll dissipate, it'll kind of move everything around for you. So you don't really need to do a lot of that. So what we'll want to do is I'm going to open up my thermal paste like so. It looks like that. It's a gray substance. And I'm going to put a piece of rice, so long grain rice size amount of thermal paste right in the middle. If you do a little extra, that's okay. Just don't put too much, and definitely don't put too little. Too much can cause troubles just the same way that too little can, where you aren't getting great contact. Your CPU, this processor, can warm up drastically to the point where your computer won't turn on. So you need to put the correct amount of thermal paste. This guy here is about right. Okay, so now I'm gonna take my water block, which again is this guy right here, and I'm literally just gonna sit it right on top. Nice and easy. Actually, before I do that, I need to install some brackets. Let me do that really quick. So I'm gonna take my board out of the way. I did it a little out of order, sorry guys. I'm gonna install some brackets onto this to make sure that I can seat it on top of my CPU. Now, these water coolers, these CPU coolers, come with these mounting brackets. My motherboard is for an AMD processor. Let's get this guy right here. AMD bracket, 2-piece. I have an AMD processor, AMD is the brand, and I need to install the correct brackets because they do fit differently from other processors like Intel, for example. So I'll take this, install my mounting bracket. It does get installed a very specific way, like so. I believe, let me check my instructions to make sure that I'm installing it correctly. I do have it upside down. Nice, so it's gonna sit just like that. And all we're gonna do is we're gonna take some screws for my brackets. It even says it for me. And I'm gonna open this guy up. And install that. Get a hold of it. There we go. Okay, that's just literally gonna get installed just like that. I'm gonna sit that down. I'm gonna tighten it because this kind of has a little track for me to make sure I'm doing it in the correct location. Okay, same thing. I'm just literally tightening these guys really tight. Because what we're gonna wanna do is we wanna make sure that this block is making really good contact with our CPU, because this is what's keeping it cool. Okay, so I'm gonna do the same thing on the other side. I'm gonna take my bracket, and we're gonna take our CPU. Uh-oh. Yeah, see, this is why we have magnetic screwdrivers. Okay. I'm literally just gonna tighten this guy again, all the way, and try not to strip our screws. Okay. Very nice. Okay, looks pretty good. No movement here. Awesome. So, next step is, again, it does say to wipe the CPU surface on the instructions. That'll be step 6 here is what I'm looking at. Right there. Wipe it off. However, this CPU has never been used before. There's never been any thermal paste applied to it other than what I just did. So this part isn't quite necessary as of right now. If you are at a point where this is not your first time installing, you'll likely have a lot of thermal paste left over from your last build. So you need to make sure you wipe that off. Okay, so my brackets are installed. I need to go ahead and apply that onto my motherboard. And again, we're keeping it all the same way as we had it before. So what we're gonna do is we're literally gonna take our bracket, and it should fit nice and perfect. And then I do want my thermal paste to be squished on there, so I'm gonna push it down kind of hard. Nice and hard. Cool. So that's gonna make all that thermal paste we put a rice size amount of, and it's gonna squish it all around the CPU. Nice and flat layer all over the CPU. So next is we need to make sure that this is mounted onto the motherboard. So our cooler came with a few extra screws. There's also some springs in here that we'll need. So I'll take my spring, and I'll put it on all 4 of these guys here. Okay. And then I'm gonna take my screws and I'm gonna hand tighten them at first. And I say at first, we're gonna screw these down afterwards as well, but I wanna make sure that everything is nice and even before I start using any extra tools. Because this, again, it does need to make really good contact with our motherboard. So we need to make sure that it's completely seated on there. Any extra space or air in between this block and the processor, the CPU, is not usually a good thing. Again, because these things warm up a lot. Get really hot. Okay. Nice. All right, so now that that's in, we're gonna go ahead and tighten it all the way. So take that, nice and tight. And this will go down for quite a bit. Again, we install a spring, so that will really do wonders for you. Nice and tight. All the way down, you get a lot of resistance. Okay, same thing here. Nice. And lastly, okay, looking good. Make sure my last one's nice and tight. Okay, great. Our CPU cooler is installed on our motherboard. The next step is going to be, well, installing all of this into the computer once we have our RAM applied to. Okay, so the last thing we're going to do before we install our motherboard with all these parts into our case is we're going to install a RAM. So RAM is a little tricky in the sense that it does require a specific orientation. This is one, these are called DIMMs. There's one stick of RAM. And what I want to do is I want to make sure that this is installed correctly. You'll notice at the bottom here where all these gold pins are, first things first, make sure you don't touch them. But it's actually askew. This part's a little longer than this part. So you need to make sure that that lines up with what's on your motherboard here. You'll notice one part, this section, is a little longer than this section. So I'm gonna actually need to flip my RAM around here. Make sure we install it correctly. Cool. Now the only thing is my CPU block is pretty big, so it may have troubles sitting all of my RAM in all these slots here. And if that's the case, then I'll just run with 2. No big deal. Okay, actually these guys come out. So you can sit your RAM properly. These stay in place. Okay, so I'm just gonna take this. I'm gonna hopefully sit it down without it flexing too much. And if it does, great. If not, then, well, I'm okay with, yeah, just 2. It's kind of pushing over to the side too much. I don't wanna break it. So what I'll do instead is I'm just gonna install 2 sticks of RAM. You do have to press these down kinda hard. You'll kind of hear it clicking in place. And you want to make sure again that those pins are lining up. Those pins are lining up. And I'll triple check to make sure that I installed it correctly. Here. Yep. Cool. You'll see this piece at the end here kind of clipped in place as soon as I pressed it down all the way. Which is great. That's what we want. Okay, so then I'm gonna install one more. Now, motherboards actually have a pretty interesting component where when you're installing RAM, it's usually either 2 sticks of RAM or 4 sticks of RAM. You don't typically want to install 3 sticks because they're actually kind of set up a little askew. There's some technical details we could go into to describe why that's the case, but when you're installing RAM, you'll either want to use 2 sticks, 2 DIMM, or 4 DIMM. And because this spot is a little too close to my block, my CPU block, I'm not going to install that for now. It's just the 2. So I'm going to install it in the 2nd slot and the 4th slot. You can actually refer to your motherboard instructions for more details on that as well. So I'm going to do the same thing here. Just confirm that I'm installing it correctly. Press it down. And again, it kind of slides into place. Looks good. Okay, my RAM is installed. It's in place. RAM, once you've gotten it there, is pretty much in order. There's nothing really else you have to do with it. So, looks good. All right, we're gonna go ahead and install our motherboard into the case. Now that we've installed our RAM, CPU, CPU cooler, and our hard drive. So we're gonna take our motherboard, gonna seat that right on in here. And there's these little screw things, they're risers. They basically just make it so this motherboard can kind of sit up off the case. It's also done for a couple other things, but that's the most important one for now. And these screw holes you'll see on the motherboard kind of fit in with those, just like so. So what we'll do now is we'll make sure these cables are not in the way. We'll plug these in just a little bit. I want to make sure that not only does this get installed properly, it'll be kind of up in this area here, but then also our motherboard's being installed properly as well. So I'm gonna put this out of the way for now. Just kind of sit it in the corner. I'm gonna take all my cables, kind of toss them out of the way. I wanna make sure that the ports on the side here line up with the side of my case. And then also the ports on my motherboard line up perfectly as well. Cool. So then I'm gonna take some motherboard screws. Those are these guys right here. And I'm going to install them into each of the holes here. And again, should be, they were saying about 9. You wanna kinda, again, keep them somewhat tight. You don't want this thing rattling around inside of your computer, but you also don't want it to be too tight to where you end up flexing your motherboard and potentially damaging it. So I'm just screwing these in to where I'm receiving some tension. Cool, should be one more on the top here. Wonderful. You may notice that some cases come with more of those risers where you may need to end up installing them depending on your motherboard. And installing is pretty easy. You just kind of screw them in based on the holes that your motherboard has here. All these guys there. Luckily for me, my case already has them in the right place for me. Cool. And we'll double check to make sure that I didn't miss any after this screw. Okay, so we got one in the corner, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. And I do not see any more, so I think we're a success. Okay, so once we've installed our motherboard like so, we want to kind of do a couple of things. One is we want to install not only our radiator in place, but there's also, you'll kind of notice a bunch of these little ports here, these headers, these little pins in the corner there. These are going to be for our fans. And some of them are specific to our CPU cooler, and they say it on the motherboard a lot of times where it goes. Others are things like, this is a motherboard power cable. So we need to make sure that we have that all nice and plugged in before we install our radiator to the top here, because it can be kind of hard to get your hands in there. If you're like me, you have kind of big hands, it's hard to fit your hands in there to get those installed. So I like to install my cables before I finish mounting my radiator. So that's gonna be next. Let me grab some cables. Okay, so I've gotten my cables. These are motherboard cables that are coming from our power supply. I'm gonna feed them in through the back because I wanna route all my cables back there. I'm gonna take that, get those tossed up in there. Cool. And you'll notice, so this here is a 2 by 1, 2, 3, 4. So 2 by 4. And these are, you'll notice, 2, and they come apart. 2 by 4. So we need 2 of these next to each other. So we're gonna install that first. On the right side. And they go, just literally slide them in there. You just gotta make sure that they line up here. Looks like they do. Slide them in. Kind of hard to get, again, your hands in there, which is why we do this first. There we go. So there's one cable. I'm gonna pull this nice and tight so it looks a little bit better. There we go. And then I'm gonna do the same thing. I got another cable here, but this one, I'm only gonna use one of them. It's gonna look like this. So I'll take this cable, again, I'll feed it through. I'm gonna feed both of them for now, and then I'll work through that later. So I'll go ahead and install that next to it. Perfect. And you'll kind of feel it click into place. Great. And I'll just kind of, again, pull these down a little bit so they look a little bit nicer. Okay. So that's that. Looks good. Next is, we've got a couple of different cables we're gonna end up plugging in here as well. And luckily they're all labeled. So this guy here is kind of a new feature. It's called DRGB. It's a, RGB is red, green, blue. It's a just color scheme. And basically this means that this block here actually can light up alongside my fans, but it needs to be plugged into something in order for it to allow that. One is this guy here, and this is going to be power for your pump, which is this. And then this is going to be the RGB part. And there are places on your motherboard specific for these things. So one of which is actually down here. And it actually says it on the motherboard. It's going to be a little hard to see, but on the very bottom, I'm going to route it through the bottom here because I see it down here at the bottom. It says RGB header 2, and just to the right of it, there's a Gen 2 addressable RGB. That's this guy right here. You'll notice the pins on this, there's 2, and then a space, and then 1. It's very similar to what you see right here. There's 2, a space, and then there's 1. Here it is. Okay, so what we're gonna do is we're just literally gonna plug that in into the addressable one. And actually, there's gonna be a cable just chilling, sitting there, not really doing much of anything. And that is A-okay. You can always configure that later. Might have to seat this there. Nope, there we go. Awesome. And then I'll just kind of route my cable so it looks a little nicer. Just like that. Okay. Luckily the case is kind of dark, so you can't really see these cables. So it looks a lot better when everything is in place. Okay. This next cable is going to be power for your pump. And you'll notice on my motherboard here, it says CPU OPT, it says CPU fan, and then it says AIO pump. AIO stands for all-in-one, and that's exactly what I have. I have an all-in-one CPU cooler, and I'm gonna plug that into that last port for AIO pump. So I'll take that, plug it into the last one, like so. And then again, I'm gonna route my cables so they're out of the way here, but they also look a little bit nicer. Kind of just like fold this on itself. Very nice. Okay, so we've gotten our pump and the fans attached to it plugged in. Looks good. Now we need to get, and we've got this installed, now we need to get our radiator installed. So, the radiator is kind of similar to the pump where there are power cables for the fans that we need to plug in. So I'll grab that here. Okay. So again, there's a bunch of power cables just all over the place. There's a bunch of things here. Okay, so we've got, again, OPT, fan, and luckily they're just power cables, so they all work, similar to each other. So we're gonna set this down. I can take all of my cables here. I'm gonna take off one of the splitters. Great. And I'm gonna actually say that I want to take these two cables. They're both the exact same, one for each fan. 4-pin power cables, and I'm literally just gonna plug them in. So there are 2 ports here. There's one that says CPU fan, and technically the other one is not CPU fan, but it works identically. So we can plug it in all the same, just like that. Okay, so notice on our CPU cooler, on the radiator, there's a bunch of other cables laying around. These are RGB, again, these are RGB cables, and I don't have there's another component called a hub that you need to get in order to get these to work. So the fans are still gonna work, it's still gonna cool our system, but I'll get this at a later time. And that is perfectly fine to do. Okay, so now I'm gonna go ahead and start kind of installing this here, my CPU cooler. And you'll kind of see it sits a little odd, but it'll sit kind of like so. And these cables are gonna need to be routed through the bottom, so I'm actually gonna go ahead and start doing that too. Pull this up again a little bit, take some of these cables, and I'm just gonna push them through the hole here at the bottom. That way, when I seat this radiator and the fans, it'll look a little bit nicer. I won't have cables just going everywhere. And we can mount all that through the back. Okay. Last one. Okay. All right, nice. You'll see, again, there are cables right here, but I'm gonna pull those through the other side in just a little bit. So, good news is now we get to mount our radiator and our fans to our case. So, let's do it. Pull this back a little bit. And then I'm gonna kind of put it to the side here so we can all see what's going on. I'm gonna take some of my screws, and these are ones that came with my CPU cooler. I'm literally just gonna take them and I'm gonna install them near the top here. Make sure the right ones here. I actually don't need the long ones, I need the short ones. There you go. Cool. And again, I'm not gonna tighten these completely just because I need some clearance to move this around. In the instance, it doesn't seat really great with my case. So I'm gonna keep it loose for now. Great. Looks like this is gonna seat pretty nice. Last one. All right, so now I'm gonna move my radiator around just a little bit to where it looks a little bit nicer inside my case. So I'm gonna kind of slide it to the left until it touches headers near the shield. This is where all my input output ports are on the side here. So I'm gonna push my radiator, the thing we've been working on, over just far enough to where it touches it. So I can't really move it any further. That's okay. And then now I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna tighten those screws that we seated earlier pretty tight, so we don't have any vibration, no movement, nothing. Looks pretty good. Okay. Looks pretty good to me. No movement, you can't really like slide it around anymore. It looks great. So now what we're gonna do is we're gonna take the cables that we loosely seated in the back, and we're gonna go ahead and pull those cables through. See? That's a lot of what we were working with earlier. So we're gonna take those cables, and we're again just gonna literally pull them through here. Look at that. Cover came off here. Okay. So now, if you were to look at the front, it looks nice and clean. Okay, so we need to take some of our cables from our front ports here and install them on the motherboard. It's easier to do this cable from the back. So that's what we'll do. Take this, kind of route it through here. And we'll just plug. Careful not to bend your pins. And kind of pull your cabling back through here. There we go, like so. I know it looks a little bit like a jumbled mess right now, but we're gonna cable manage that real soon. Okay, I've pulled through all the other necessary cables and we'll kind of see those on the other side. Great. So there's a few things to look out for. One are these three. These are all fan and headers. And they're all gonna just really plug in to kind of similar places. I have 3 fans up here in the front. Those are all gonna get plugged into fans. You'll kind of see there are a bunch of different 4 pins just kind of laying around here. Those are all typically for the fans. So you just plug those in accordingly. There's one. And 2. There's some more over there, but you know what? We're just gonna plug that one in the bottom here. Okay. And again, we can just kind of push our cables back through here. Like so. Not bad. We'll make those look a lot nicer real soon. We've got an audio cable, and that audio cable, it's kind of clearly defined here on the board in the corner. Ports like so. This will have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 on one side, and then 4 with a space on the other, which corresponds directly with what this has. Looks good. Okay, so now we can take this audio cable, plug her in, like so. Just kind of seat it down. Again, be careful with these pins, they are very fragile. And then we can take all these tiny cables. These are the hardest ones. And they're hard because they're tiny and there's a bunch of them. And it's hard to sometimes see on the motherboard what goes where. But right here is a bunch of different labels that are kind of further on this side. And it's unique to each motherboard. So copying what we have may work. It may also not work. But luckily there are labels on the motherboard that say exactly what goes where and in what order. Like for example, some are positive, some are negative. So we need to be kind of cautious of that. Keep an eye on it. So first things first, I'm taking my reset switch, and it looks like my reset is 4, like so, and 3. Okay, next is going to be my power switch, and it looks like power is this one right here. And then we have power LEDs, and it says on mine the negative, which corresponds to this negative. It says it on the, labeled it on there for us. It goes not in the bottom, in the top, and then the very last one, power LED positive on the other side. So there we go, all plugged in. Looks really nice. Okay, so now we're gonna install a fan for intake. It's gonna go right here, and then we're gonna install our gigantic power cable for our motherboard. We'll install our graphics card, and then we'll go to our power supply. So first things first, let's get the fan installed. Okay. Just like we've done all along, notice this fan is a little different, and that's okay. Basically, from the outside, we're going to install this. Make sure I don't strip anything here. Looks like it's kind of a little difficult. Stripping anything, get the cockeyed angle or anything. Okay. And then, last but not least, I have to get a bigger driver for this. Give ourselves a little more room for airflow. All right, so now I'm gonna go ahead and tighten this pretty hard here. Not really a lot of tech in these fans, so you don't have to worry about flexing boards or things like that. This needs to be tight so there's no sound coming from vibrations, all that sort of stuff. So nice and tight is the best way to go. All right. Great, so there's that. We're gonna take that cable and we're just gonna route it really just right here, nice and easy. I'm gonna kind of fold it over itself again. And then I'm gonna plug that in right around here. Cable out of the way here. Cool. That's wonderful. Okay. Set that down a little bit more. Out of the way. Looks nice. So there's that. Now we're gonna take our power supply cable for the motherboard. We're gonna plug that guy in. This is primary power for your motherboard. Pretty important that we use this because it doesn't really turn on if you don't. All right. Just kind of, again, fold that on here a little bit. Okay. Looks pretty good. All right. That looks great. Okay. Next is going to be the graphics card. That's great. Okay, so now let's install that graphics card I was talking about earlier. This graphics card is massive. It's huge. So you'll see the front. It takes up 3 whole slots. Pretty big. So we need to take off a few of these shields. So I'm gonna go ahead and unscrew those. And then I'm just gonna set them to the side. When we take them off like this, you actually won't replace them at all. So feel free to keep them for later or do what you want with them. Great. So I'm gonna go ahead and take off the peeling protective film. And I think there's one last one on here. Yep. Man, EVGA does a great job with their cards. Okay, should be all the film for the most part. Cool. So I'm gonna take my cables, I'm gonna move them back here. I went ahead and routed all my power cables that I'm gonna need for this graphics card. Not all graphics cards have additional power cables, but this one does. So we'll go ahead and we'll see that. Perfect. Kind of just press it in place. It should almost click. You'll see this little kind of piece in the corner there. It's actually a fin. I think I might kind of see it a little bit better. This right here is what I'm talking about. This little fin, in order to take your card out, you'll need to press that down like so, and then it allows you to pull your card out like that. But when you're placing it in, you should place it until that fin goes up, like so. Very nice. And actually, this card, while it is up to 3 ports, we may be... Oh, no, it's gonna require that to be... Yeah, see how there's some space here? Some cases you can leave these on, but looks like we do need all 3 of them off. So now what we'll do is we're gonna take those same screws we used before and we're gonna seat our card with it. These need to be a little bit sort of tight because you don't want your card moving around a lot. Again, these cards are really, really heavy. So it's really important that you make sure that they're tight, they don't move around, stuff like that. Very nice. So now I can take those power cables that I routed earlier and plug them in. And again, these are 2, 4, 6, 8 pins. So we need to make sure that we have all 8 set up and ready to go. 8 pin. These kind of come apart, so sometimes you have to play with it. I'm literally just going to take this and seat it. I'm going to do the same thing. I have 2 more. Okay. Okay, there's 2, and then here's 3. And yes, you do need all 3 of these plugged in this particular card. Other cards, again, you'll need to make sure all of the PCIe, that's what these are called, power cables, are plugged in, or your card will not work as expected. Okay, I'm gonna route my cables a little bit to the side because there are fans in the front that I don't want to block. So, looks pretty good. Okay, push my cables down, and there we have it. Graphics card's installed. All right, we're on the home stretch. So this is gonna be the power supply. We're installing the power supply here. There's a lot of power cables that we need to place in here. And it's usually hard to put this in, install it with the screws, and then plug everything in. So we're gonna plug everything in first. So you'll notice all of these have names attached to them. RE25, PSU, PSU being power supply. It's just a type of cable as well. They actually correspond to a specific port on the back here. CPU, PCIe, peripheral, IDE, SATA Molex, MB. It's a lot of different things. They seem like kind of scary words, but that's okay because luckily these ports only fit on certain portions of this power supply. You'll notice this is a 2x4, and the only 2x4s back here go with CPU and PCIe. It just so happens that these 2 cables that I'm holding are CPU power cables, so it makes sense. CPU goes right there. So we're gonna go ahead and install both of these. We literally are just gonna take them, press them in until they click. Okay. We're gonna do the same thing with the rest of these. Now, this cable is pretty big. It's pretty monstrous. You'll see this one says M/B. And this is actually the big motherboard cable that we had on the other side. So we're gonna do just the exact same thing. I'm gonna take it, grab it, press it in, install. Install. Great. Looks great. Okay. Next, we're gonna install some more. This is a 2x6 if you notice. This one is one of those peripheral ones. So it says IDE, SATA, Molex on the bottom there. So we're gonna install that in there. Okay. Same thing, we got a couple more cables. This is another one of those. This is a 2x8. So we're gonna go ahead and install that one. Right around here, let me just move this around. Okay, 2x8. And looks good. And our last one. Okay, so now that we have all of our power cables plugged in, we need to go ahead and seat our power supply. It's going to be kind of interesting. We may have to remove some things to do that. Let's try without it first. So we're gonna kind of seat this in there. Yeah, doesn't look like it's sitting too nicely. So here's what we'll do. We're gonna take our screwdriver right here, and this little cage here is just gonna kind of should allow us, there may be one on the other side too. No. Should be able to slide this. Yeah, look at that. We can slide that down. Makes it easier for us to move our power supply around. So all I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take this PSU power supply. I'm gonna kind of slide it in there. It's gonna slide in a little rough, but that's okay. I'm gonna stick my hand in the other side and move it. Okay, we can kind of, honestly with these cables, you can kind of just almost shove them in here for now, just so it fits, just so we can get these things in here. It's really all we're looking for right now. Okay, I'm gonna reattach this screw for my, this is actually a hard drive cage. We'll install a bunch of hard drives in here. Cool. Okay, so now we're gonna take the power supply and we're gonna actually install the screws for it. So, turn that around just a tad. And I have a few screws here set aside. This should align, and if it doesn't, we just need to push things over a little bit. It should align pretty nicely. It does. Pretty nicely with our case. Look at that. Gotta press it down if it doesn't quite sit down all the way. Okay, there's one. And again, I'm not tightening completely, just kind of putting it in there to make sure everything is gonna sit in a spot I hope that it's gonna sit in. Okay. Lastly, all right. Now I can tighten everything down. Okay. Technically, that's all you really need. The last thing would really be cable managing it, making it look a little nicer. Because this kind of doesn't look great. But thankfully, cases like this have these things called shrouds that go on the back that we can install. Sweet. Here's one of them. Here's two of them. Very nice. These can actually just kind of sit over, usually the back side here. Maybe, let's see. Actually, what's the other way? Take this down. There we go. Look at that. It kind of covers all your cables up nicely. Allows you to really seat that on there. Makes things look so much nicer. This one goes on the other side over here. I believe. Where's this one go? Yeah, this kind of seats up there. It just really helps with cables. So I'm gonna grab some screws and I'll be right back. Great. So these cables are kind of everywhere. We need to get them routed a little more appropriately so it looks a little more aesthetically pleasing inside of our case. You can do a lot of that with cable ties. You can also use these shrouds that my case has kind of attached for us. So what we'll do is we'll take this, kind of route it through here. This seats sort of near the kind of bottom, like so. Seats in there. Kind of pull that cable through. Want to make sure it's not getting crushed on anything. These guys can go right up top, and you'll notice these kind of sit nicely at the top here. So really just, after that, just kind of hand tightening these in. We'll probably screw them in after, just to make sure we don't have any rattling. I don't want any movement inside of the case if we can help it. Okay, and then the very, very last piece is gonna be this last shroud going in the back here. Really, again, just kind of tie these things up for us. I'm gonna actually pull some of these cables through too, make them look a little bit better. All right. Okay, so all right. So luckily this bottom shroud here will also kind of come up, allowing you to cover the remainder of any of the cables that you had. Look at that. All of those cables that we saw previously cleaned up. It looks so much better now. Okay. So we can put our side panels on, put everything back the way that it was, and then we can power it up to make sure all our fans work, it stays powered on, everything. Let's do it.
All right, and there you have it. We have a fully built custom PC from start to finish. If you have any other questions, let us know in the comments, and we'll see you in the next video. All right, thanks for watching. And if you have any other questions, just let us know in the comments. And Brandon, thank you for letting us be part of your new computer build.
Thank you for having me. Yeah, this was awesome.
Yeah, I had a great time doing that. And that's all we have for today. We'll see you later.